stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everybody. Well, it is so good to be home. It really has been a wonderful experience. It's been tough. There have been some days when I've been really exhausted. There's been days when I've been really frustrated. But my family has been blessed. My kids have been happy. I've been safe. I've made a lot of friends. I've learned a lot. I'm glad to be home, and I'm ready to work hard through the summer and hit the ground running next year. So I have very little to complain about. I'm just so grateful overall. Here's a quick overview for you of the session. This is one of our longest sessions, 95 days. Generally, they shoot for 3 months. We were supposed to be done March 25th, and we finished April 12th. So 95 days, 8,000 plus miles of driving back and forth from Blackfoot to Boise, 445 votes. Some of those were committee votes, and I probably missed a few, but I tried to keep a pretty good record. 445 votes during those days, dozens of new friends, thousands of emails, hundreds of prayers. That's the last 3 months for me. I was on 3 committees. Over in the House, when you get there, the House leadership chooses where people go, and generally if you were a more senior legislator, you have more of a say. If you're a freshman, you kind of get whatever they give you. So, welcome, come on in. So I was assigned to the State Affairs Committee, which deals with a lot of the moral issues, a lot of the controversial issues, gun rights, all that kind of stuff goes to the State Affairs Committee. Welcome, come on in, it is so good to see you. And then I served on Judiciary and Rules, and also on Environment, Energy, and Technology, which deals with mostly the site type stuff, and utilities, things like that. I loved my committees. They were real substantive, a lot of discussion, and I really came to appreciate the committee process. So if you haven't ever followed a bill through the process in the legislature, someone sponsors the bill, and they bring it to a committee, first of all. And when they come to the committee, they present that bill, and there's 15, 18 legislators sitting in a semicircle, and they all have your bill in front of them, and they ask you questions about everything having to do with this bill. How much is it going to cost? Where are we going to get the money? What are the impacts of the bill? Have you worked with the people that are going to be affected by the bill? Why did you choose to do it this way? What's been tried in the past? How will that change? And there are so many questions that get asked in those committees, and then the committee at the end of that has the opportunity to decide whether they're going to send that bill to the floor, or whether they're going to amend it, or whether they're just going to kill it. There's a lot of death and carnage in the legislative process. Things get killed all the time. If a bill makes it through the committee process, then it goes to the floor where that process gets repeated again. The first part of the session this year was really slow. There was some things happening in the courts with Medicaid expansion, and everybody was just kind of sitting to see what was going to happen. And so the first part of the session was pretty slow. Welcome, come on in. And then the middle part of the session was incredibly intense. We'd be on the floor at 9 o'clock in the morning sometimes, and then you'd still have committees, and we'd go until it was time for lunch, and you'd take a little lunch break, and then you'd come back, and it was just bill after bill, vote after vote, having to just be right on the edge of your seat, because you've got to know what's coming next, and there could be important things, and you can't miss the chance to ask questions or debate something that's really going to be important. So those days were really mentally exhausting during the middle of the session. Yeah.
Do you get enough time to review those bills so you can understand what they are if you have so many?
For the most part, but you do have to really be on top of it, and there are times when it's really difficult because there are so many. You can see them coming because when they leave the committee, they put them on the second reading calendar, And so anything on the second reading calendars could be voted on the next day. So you usually have a day's notice. And you've got to be reading the bill. But then the other thing that I really learned to do is talk to people that I trusted that served on the committees where they heard the bills. Because, you know, you can read it, but if you talk to the people that were involved in the conversation, they could say, well, you know, that really was a non-controversial bill. Everybody liked what was in it. It's going to be really great. Or they might say, boy, that barely squeaked out of committee. And there's some things that we were concerned about. And so that was really helpful. And then just being able to read it. I kept a spreadsheet of everything that was coming up, and I'd read it, and I'd put my vote, and I'd put my comments out to the side, and then I'd talk to people. And sometimes after I talked to people, that would change. But it would always give me a game plan as I went to the floor. So that's kind of how I handled that. But it was tough, and there are issues that, especially as a freshman legislator, I was seeing them for the first time, and when I go back next year, some of that will be a little bit easier because I'll be more familiar with some of the agencies and some of the things that go on. So that will help. And I learned a lot too. That's another thing I will say is I was not perfect. Honestly, at the end of the session, there are some things that I look back on and I think, boy, you know, I do that a little differently next time. But I think that's okay. I think we do that with everything we do in life, and I still feel really good about the service that I gave because I know that I did my very best. So it was intense, and then the end, there was a lot of anxiety and animosity going around. And one of the things I really saw is that in Idaho, our representative system is amazing. It really is amazing. And because of the way things are, we do have a divide in our legislature between the House and the Senate. And the House tends to be a lot more conservative. Most of the senators moved to the Senate from the House. They're more senior legislators. They've been in the legislative environment longer, and they are less sympathetic, I think, to a lot of the grassroots stuff that comes out of the House. And so there were a lot of bills that came out of the House of Representatives with really strong support. And then they went over to the Senate and they didn't even get a hearing, or they got killed. And that was a little frustrating sometimes. So, you know, if there were things that a person wanted to do to improve our ability to get some of those grassroots, more conservative issues actually through the legislature, looking at what's happening with the Senate would be an important thing to do. So that was an interesting thing to observe, and that got more frustrating as we got to the end of the session and we were dealing with some of these really big issues, and the Senate we were throwing stuff back and forth, and we were amending their bills and they were amending our bills, and we all wanted to go home. But we made it through the end, and there were some really good things that I think came out at the end. The picture on the top there was the board of bills to be voted on one of the days. And some of the legislators that have been there for years told me it was the first time they'd ever seen so many bills on the board that they had to stick papers across the bottom for some of the bills. And the ones across the bottom are bills that were on general orders. They've been sent by a committee to be amended. And so those bills were waiting for people to submit amendments that could be considered on the floor. But all the rest of them, on the left is the second reading bills. Those are the ones that we know will be added to the reading calendar the next day. And the ones on the right are the third reading bills. And when we would come to the legislative session with a board that looked like that, you would just do bill after bill after bill after bill until you just couldn't, and then you stop and whatever was left would roll into the next day. So, and the bottom left is my view from my floor seat. So, all right, so I thought tonight I would just kind of pick 4 significant issues that we dealt with during the session and give you a little more background on those things and some of what I saw with them. Are you able to see? I don't want to be in people's way. So Medicaid expansion was, of course, a huge issue. We had the initiative process, some attempts to amend that were in the media a lot, and I'm guessing some of you may have some questions about that. There were some interesting things that happened with the rules that executive agencies pass or make into law, and I'll tell you a little more about that, and then some financial things that I wanted to share with you. So we can go, I'll give kind of a high level thing, and then you can feel free to ask questions, but there are 4 things up there, and I'm thinking, how late do we want to go, Wendy?
I put 8:30.
8:30? Okay, so we've got about an hour. So the more questions we ask, the slower we'll go, and if we go through all this, then we'll just answer whatever questions you happen to have at the end. So let's talk Medicaid expansion first. Medicaid expansion passed on the ballot in the state of Idaho with 61% of the statewide vote. In Bingham County, it was 52% of the vote in favor of Medicaid expansion. So Medicaid expansion took our traditional Medicaid program, which has usually been for the disabled, the elderly, the children, people that really can't do for themselves, and it expanded that now to include able-bodied adults. So this passed on the ballot, and it was now the responsibility of the legislature to figure out what to do about that. When it was put on the ballot, it did not have a funding mechanism. A lot of other states that have implemented Medicaid expansion have had a funding mechanism, a sales tax or a sin tax or something like that, that the voters could see, oh, we're going to do this, and we're going to fund it this way, so we know this tax is going to go up. Well, we didn't have that in our ballot initiative. So the legislature had to figure out how to fund it. And as part of figuring out how to fund it, we really had to get down to the nitty-gritty of how it was going to impact our state and how much we were willing to fund. I like the example of when people voted for Medicaid expansion, they said, we want a car. So then the question is, what kind of a car do we think we voted for? And I got a lot of emails from people who thought that they voted for a Camaro. And they said, don't you dare put any limitations on this. We want 100% everything covered for everybody. And if you do anything less, then you are an enemy of the voice of the people. And then, there were a lot of legislators that looked at that and said, well, we'll give them a car, but it's got to be efficient. It's got to get good gas mileage. And, so this was the discussion that we were having in the House. Just to give you a sense of what Medicaid looks like on the state level, our 2020 Medicaid budget is $2.8 billion with a B. Now, part of that is covered by the federal government, but that's based on their willingness to cover that. So right now, the agreement is with Medicaid expansion, we are anticipating that the federal government will cover 90%, the state of Idaho will cover 10%. But there is a chance that that could change in the future. So that's something that we always keep in mind too. So if we cover 10% of 2.8 billion, that's 280 million. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. And you have to keep in mind this budget, the 2020 budget, only includes a half a year of Medicaid expansion because it starts halfway through the year. So the Medicaid expansion piece this year is going to cost $200 million. The expectation is that it's going to cost somewhere between $400 and $500 million a year over the next foreseeable future. Although that number does go up every year when you look at their forecast. And that number is based on the assumption that we are going to continue to have a 2.9% unemployment rate and an estimation that the administrative load will be 0%. So all these numbers that we are looking at and have been given are based on an absolute best case scenario that comes from a group called Milliman, and they do a lot of forecasting for the legislature. So overall, expansion is going to increase the cost of Medicaid about 15 to 20% in terms of our state budget. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. Now, voters were told that it would expand Medicaid to about 60,000 people. By the time we were talking about the costs in the legislature, we were being told 90,000 people. And a lot of the states that have expanded Medicaid have found that their estimates were about half or even less in some states than what it actually turned out to be. So there are a lot of things here that still remain to be seen, that we just don't know about exactly how this is going to impact our state. So one of the things that was really important to the representatives in the House was that we had some work requirements associated with Medicaid. Partly because the voters were told when they voted on Medicaid expansion, over here on the right is a picture of what you were all sent in the mail before you voted. This is the Secretary of State voter guide here, and the number one argument in favor of Proposition 2 said that it would help more than 62,000 Idahoans. These are working Idahoans who make less than $17,000 a year. They work in jobs that don't offer health care, and this initiative will help hard-working Idahoans who can't afford life-saving care for asthma and blah. So that's the sales pitch that was being made for Proposition 2 at the time voters voted on it. After the fact, everybody came back and spun the same thing and said, oh, nope, this is not just for working people. We do not want work requirements. We don't want any sideboards or limitations. We want full-out Medicaid expansion. But that really is not what the people in Bingham County had in front of them when 52% of them voted to say, okay, we will fund Medicaid expansion. So it was important to us that we have work requirements, partly because I believe that's what the voters anticipated. Nobody said, I want to give people free health care so they can sit home on their couch if they're able-bodied and capable. The other reason, of course, is that if we're going to help people, we want to give them a hand up and not a hand out. And work requirements have been shown to do that for people and to help them actually move off of our welfare programs and be more successful. So that was another reason. So we were able to get some sideboards put on Medicaid expansion. Now, these have to be approved by the federal government. So they're not guaranteed still at this point. But we were able to pass some legislation directing the state to apply for waivers with the federal government. Some of the waivers were that we're going to review Medicaid if that 90-10 match ever changes, and we may choose to discontinue it. That's important to our state, because if it goes from 90-10 to 70-30, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars a year, all of a sudden, we could be in a lot of trouble financially as a state. There were some things that allowed them to apply for mental health services to be covered under Medicaid. There were some, this was one that a lot of people were really excited about, and that is, if you've ever been on Medicaid, you might have had an experience where you had a doctor that you really liked, and all of a sudden he doesn't cover Medicaid, so he's not an option for you. Well, there are a lot of people that are in, this is federal poverty level. Medicaid expansion made it so that people up to 138% of the federal poverty level could be covered by Medicaid. But right now, the people that are between 100 and 138% of the federal poverty level already have the option to have a subsidized insurance plan on the state exchange. And some of those people like their plans, and they like their doctors. And some of those plans are incredibly reasonable, like $12 a month or $35 a month with the subsidy. So one of the things that we wanted to do is give those people the opportunity to stay with their private insurance and not be forced onto Medicaid if they didn't want to be on Medicaid. So that was one of the waivers that we were able to get in. And then the work requirement is 20 hours a week. It was amazing to me how difficult it was to get this work requirement adopted. You would have thought that we were putting together some diabolical plan to torture people or something like that. But in my mind, these work requirements were very, very mild. And let me explain why I say that. Work requirements mean you have to do 20 hours a week of work, or looking for work, or training for work, or you could be a part-time student, or you can do community service. And you can have any combination of those things for 20 hours a week, and you've met the Medicaid work requirement for the expansion population. So that's something that just about anybody could do. But then the other thing is that there are a lot of exemptions. So if you're under 19, if you're over 65, if you are the primary caretaker of a child under 18, if you have disability, if you've applied for unemployment, if you are physically or mentally unable to work, all of those people are exempted from the work requirements. So the reality is that this work requirement only applies to people that don't have any other responsibilities and are completely capable of doing something, and all they're asked to do is at least 20 hours a week of something productive. So that seems pretty reasonable to me. Then the other thing to know is that if people do get dropped off of Medicaid because they don't meet the work requirement, they can reapply as soon as they're in compliance. And when they reapply, Medicaid will cover them 90 days retroactively.
Did you have any kind of a ballpark on how many people would be required to work and what it would take manpower-wise to verify that they're really working with all those exceptions?
That is a really good question, and I'm trying to remember the exact number. I can find it for you. It was like it's on the fiscal note for the bill.
Ballparks
It's like
would be great.
one point something million dollars was what the fiscal note on it said.
To verify some 10 or 20,000
And I
people
think
that
that
need
was
to be?
for the whole program, yeah. So it's not nothing, but the expectation is that if we are implementing this program, we're helping people to move off of Medicaid and to become more productive, and that the benefit of that is going to outweigh the cost of asking them to work and to be productive. So that's kind of the game, that the balancing act that we're trying to do here. One of the other things that came up with the work requirements is that a lot of the costs that we talked about as we talked about Medicaid expansion assumed that all other welfare programs would go away. That we would no longer need county indigent funds, we would no longer need substance abuse programs, and so actually, should I take just a second? Let me find this for you. This was really interesting to me. When we were debating Medicaid, Winnie Harmon from Idaho Falls is the co-chair of the financial committee. And so she went through on the floor the list of all the things that they've cut in the state budget to try to cover the cost of Medicaid. And a lot of what they did, they tried to make the cost of Medicaid look better by subtracting from it the cost of all of these other programs. So she said, Department of Health and Welfare, Adult Mental Health Services, $4.2 million cut. Community hospitalization, $1 million cut. Substance abuse treatment and prevention, $1.2 million cut. Substance abuse treatment in Department of Corrections, $1.7 million cut. We took over $900,000 out of the court's budget that was ongoing funding for substance abuse programs and put it back on a one-time basis, knowing that there's potential savings there as well. So you've actually got $834,000 to spare with the cuts we've made at this point, she said. Anyway, and then she says it's going to operate this program for 6 months starting January 1st. So the legislature was doing all they can to try to, we don't know what we still need and what we don't need, but we're doing the best we can here to try to cover these growing costs that we don't really know what they are, and try to anticipate what things we may not need as much of, because, for example, the mental health services can be covered now under Medicaid. So there are a lot of things we'll be figuring out over the next couple of years.
What about abortion? Is that all part of this?
That was something that was discussed, and there was a lot of concern about that, because one of the things that taxpayers don't want, a lot of us, is to be forced to pay for abortion if that's something that we find abhorrent. So one of the things that I think will help with that to a degree is that they asked people on Medicaid to use a medical home, which means a doctor's office for their services. And then if they're going to go to another provider, including for fertility issues or abortions or other things like that, they have to have a referral from the provider. Mm-hmm. And so there was some hope that that would help us avoid spending a lot of money on Planned Parenthood and other things like that, that it would keep those dollars away from some of those things that taxpayers don't want to pay for. Yeah.
Was there concern that the courts, the federal courts, would overrule some of these things you've spoken of?
There is a chance, and there's a chance that we won't get some of those waivers. So we'll see. Yeah.
I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Unplanned,
Mm.
but if you haven't, go see it. It's very important that you see it.
It is worth seeing. A group of the legislators that I was friends with went and saw it during the last week when we were in that hurry up and wait time period on one of the evenings, and it was worth going, except that it really made me want to go home and hug my kids. Like, oh.
I was gonna say, I haven't seen it, but I heard a guy talking about it, and he said it's tender. He said it's not a violent experience. He says it really touched his heart.
Yeah, well, and the reality is that, the movie ends with kind of a victory there, but the reality is that the issue of abortion is still very, very live and very real, and it's serious.
He said our kids need to see it.
Yeah.
He said teenagers need to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so that's a little about Medicaid. Let me tell you a little bit about the initiative issue that we dealt with. I especially saw this from a different perspective after watching the legislative process work. I came to appreciate so much what it means to have a representative republic. And I'm not going to read the quotes up there. You can look at those. But we know that we pledge allegiance to the republic, right? Not the democracy. And there's some important reasons for that. And part of that is when you compare the representative process to a pure democratic process, in the representative process there is accountability every step along the way. Somebody has their name on it, and what they do is a matter of public record that the voters can hold them accountable for. With the initiative process, we really don't know who writes the initiatives. When you go to the box, there's no name at the bottom of that says, oh, this initiative came from this person or this organization. You don't know. And there's no formal opportunity to ask them any questions about what they were thinking or why they did it that way. And even if you did find someone to answer some questions, their question's not a matter of public record that you can hold them accountable to later on. So they can tell us that it's going to increase Medicaid by 60,000 people or that it's only going to cost this much. And if it doesn't turn out to be that way, it really doesn't matter because there's no way to hold them accountable for what they tell us. So it's really a process that allows us to get policies through that would never make it through the representative republic process. And that's happened in California and Oregon and other states around us. The initiative process has been a nightmare for those people. Just one quick example. In California, they passed an initiative that said that pigs had to be raised in a certain number of square feet. And if a pig had ever lived in less square feet than that, it couldn't be sold in the state of California. So even people importing pork into California, now if their pigs have lived in less square foot, well, now California is off limits. You can't market to those folks. So just crazy things. And it really is because it's easy for a group that represents one small segment of the population to get their issue and get the signatures, because the signature doesn't really mean you're going to even vote for it, right? And it doesn't mean you know anything about it. All it means is you're willing to see and put it on the ballot. And you can get it on the ballot and you can tell emotional stories and you can Sell your initiative with a good ad campaign, and you can make things happen that could not happen through the representative process, because the people that are accountable for it wouldn't ever dare do that.
It passed by 61%, right?
Yes.
How many legislators over there had passed by more than 61% of the vote?
You know, it was a small part of the state. I didn't count the number of districts, but I did look at the list, and most of the rural counties were in the 50%. And there was a group of them that was under 50% where it actually lost. But then in areas like Boise, it was 80 some odd percent, 70%, and really, really high in those parts of the state. So I'm sorry.
Too many liberals in Ada County.
Yeah, it's really a different political spectrum over there.
It's
than it is
California
here.
people moving into Boise.
Yeah. Yeah, so we looked at our current initiative process, and right now you have to have 18 legislative districts in order to get an initiative on the process, or on the ballot, sorry. And Ada County alone has 9 legislative districts in it. So if you have a liberal issue, you can get your issue on the ballot by going to just a handful of the most populated counties in the state of Idaho, and you can get it on the ballot right now. We wanted to change that. The other thing that we felt like we really needed to see is some kind of a fiscal note and some kind of an idea of what the source of funding was. And
Comment again?
yeah,
Think about the electoral college. If we have California, New York, Texas, New Jersey, they own it. And we don't have any say. We cannot get rid of the electoral college.
absolutely right.
Same thing in Idaho, what we're talking about. Ada County,
Yeah,
Meridian, that area, they control it.
same principle,
Yes,
same principle.
exactly right.
Absolutely.
Did this one get
Yes.
anywhere? I know somebody wrote this and
Yes, and let me tell you the story of this. It was such a valiant effort. It started in the Senate because it's most difficult to get things through the Senate. And so a lot of times things that are controversial and difficult will get started there with the idea that if you can get it through the Senate, it will be worth taking it to the House, and it will be easy to get through the House at that point. So when it came to the floor of the Senate, well, first of all, the whole process leading up to that, there was so much opposition. All of the mainstream media, the big press organizations, Reclaim Idaho, which is the organization that got Medicaid on the ballot, were up in arms over this initiative thing. They called it the Revenge on Voters Act. The government was trying to silence the voice of the people, so it was this people against the government narrative that I think is really dangerous, actually, and is being used in a lot of ways right now. And the people in the legislature, a lot of them were really afraid to support this because of the stiff opposition from the left. So it came to the Senate. When they voted on it, there were 35 members in the Senate. It looked like it was going to fail, 18-17, and then one of the senators changed his vote, and it passed the Senate, 18-17. Came to the House, and about that time we got word that now they were mounting legal challenges to it, and because we have a liberal Judge Windmill, there was some anticipation that the version of the changes that we were making may get struck down in court. And so they sat us all down and they said, okay, we've got some choices here. We can go ahead and pass what the Senate has given us and just hold on and see what happens, or we can try to tone it down just a little bit and see if we can get something that we think is more likely to make it through the court system. And there was a lot of discussion about that. The decision that was made was to go ahead and tone it down just a little bit. So before we'd said we absolutely want the rural counties to be included, we want them to collect signatures in 90% of the legislative districts. We pulled that back to 2/3 of the legislative districts. We stretched out the time frame a little bit. And just a note on the time frame, that's the thing people were most frustrated about. But right now you have 18 months. The first bill had 6 months, which is a significant cutback. But Medicaid expansion and Proposition 1, the horse racing initiative, both collected their signatures, did the actual work of collecting the signatures in under 6 months. And the 18-month time period has been there since before people, the early 1900s. Not everybody had cars. We didn't have voter lists and software that identified where the liberals and the conservatives lived. We didn't have internet. We didn't have a lot of things back then. And so it seemed reasonable to say, okay, we can handle less than 18 months now for this. We raised that to 9 months, thinking that this would maybe have a better chance in the courts. We got it passed in the House with really strong support. And the whole time this was happening, people in the Senate and the House were being told by the governor's office that if we could get this initiative changed through, that the governor would stand shoulder to shoulder with us and defend whatever came out of it. And people were told that repeatedly, both in the House and the Senate. So the week that we got the initiative through, nobody even dreamed what was going to happen. We all adjourned, went home Friday, and early Friday afternoon, I was still at the Capitol when the word came that the governor had vetoed it. And then the word went around that the lady that was with Reclaim Idaho had made a post at 8:30 the night before with a picture of her and Governor Little thanking him for his time. And I'm not saying that that's the only thing, but what I am saying is that he told us all the way through he would stand with us. And then apparently at the end, the pressure from the press and from these other organizations, and honestly from the Hospital Association too. There was a lot of pressure from the Hospital Association. The same on Medicaid. They really wanted Medicaid expansion. And the hospitals get reimbursed better than any of the low-level providers with Medicaid. So they stand to benefit financially. You remember what was the cost of a Medicaid expansion? A lot of that, $2.8 billion, is going to the hospitals and to our medical community. So they stand to gain a lot. So that was incredibly disappointing to see that go down. And right now we have 6 initiatives already coming on the ballot. They don't have the signatures collected all yet, but they are in process. Several of those deal with minimum wage. One of those would lower the requirement in terms of the number of districts you need to get something on the ballot to 10 from 18. So that now if they can get that passed, they'd only have to collect signatures in Ada County and 1 other district. And they'd have it done. Legalizing marijuana is another one that's in the process on the ballot. So this is something that we're going to continue to see is these ballot initiatives, and it's something that as voters you're going to want to watch and you're going to be aware of. And my suggestion, just based on my experience, when I go to the ballot box, I'm voting no on an initiative unless I have a good reason to vote yes. Because I think it should go through the representative process.
A good law will still be good in a year or 2 years or 4 years. If it's a bad law and you just go right ahead and push it through, you might be stuck with something you just can't change.
That's right. It's harder. It's harder to change.
Yeah.
And you know that brings up a good point too, and that is when we were working on this initiative bill and everybody was pouring in to give testimony, it was all against it. It was all people from downtown Boise. It was Democratic Women of Idaho. It was the National Organization of Women. It was the Reclaim Idaho people. All these people were pouring in and giving their testimony in opposition to the initiative bill. One of the things that I heard said a couple of times is, you don't have to worry about bad initiatives because the legislature has the constitutional authority to repeal or amend any initiative that gets passed. And that was really hard for me to listen to, honestly. because I had been getting hundreds of emails in my box, every week, hundreds of emails from people saying, don't you dare touch what the people voted for. So to have those same people, the same groups that were sending these emails come and tell me that we didn't have to worry about bad initiatives because we could change them, it just was a little painful. But
Yeah, so what could we have done to speak up, and what do we do about our governor now? Can we tell him?
we can tell him. We
Say,
can
"Have you
tell
heard
him.
this, and
Yeah.
we're not happy."
We can tell him, and it is important to speak up. I will tell you, most of the emails I got were not from my district, and a lot of them were form emails, and most of them were from liberal groups, the vast majority of them. And so if you're a legislator, maybe that's why people get more liberal the longer they stay there. Because the people that have all day to spend at the Capitol are not the people that have jobs and families and tend to be more conservative. So that's one of the realities, is that people do need to hear from you. But the encouraging thing that I will tell you is that legislators know which lobbyists will tell them both sides of the story and be completely honest. And they know when lobbyists are there because they're getting paid by someone to work on a bill. And they know when it's a form email because they've already seen it 250 times. And they know when it comes with a unique title and it's handwritten, or when it's a real citizen, an ordinary person that cares about something enough to take their time and come to the Capitol and talk about something that's important to them. And what I saw, especially at the beginning of the session, was some people that were really wise, that showed up because they cared about an issue, and they would come and they would get on the phone with the doorkeeper and just make phone calls to the legislators on their cell phones or their desk phones. Do you have a minute to talk to me? And they just make appointments, and people listen. People do listen. It doesn't mean that they still won't be influenced by other things, but you carry more weight in most people's eyes.
Well, you listen. Most of them don't.
Well, you know what? I do think that there are people that do listen. And you guys do carry some weight. And there are people, of course, that won't. You're right. You're right. But you do matter. So don't ever think you don't.
Obviously, the governor doesn't listen. I mean, after all the effort, the people want this, and he doesn't. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's not very encouraging.
Well, he
Sounds
listened
like
to
we
the
need
wrong
to be sending emails to him
Yeah.
on that issue.
We were all really nervous about what he would do with Medicaid expansion after that, because he had already said that he wasn't real excited about work requirements. And after he vetoed the initiative bill, we thought, oh, maybe he's going to veto our work requirements. But we'd already said in the House, we will not fund expansion without work requirements. And there was enough of a majority in the House that would not back down on that if he had vetoed it, we probably would have been there for a couple more weeks. And we would have been running another bill. So I like to think that helped. I don't know. Yeah.
Was there any feeling there early on in this issue that the legislature had a choice, that they could choose not to fund it or to implement it?
Medicaid expansion?
Yes.
Yeah, you know what? I'll tell you what I did. When I went to Boise, one of the things that I really struggled with is I'm an idealist. I'm a principle-centered idealist. And we don't live in a perfect world. And so one of the big questions that I grappled with before I went there is, what am I going to do when I am stuck in a spot where I feel like I have to compromise? And when is compromise okay and when is it not? And the decision that I made is, for me, because we live in a real world, I will make a compromise that will take us from where we are to a better spot. It doesn't have to be the perfect spot, but if it's a better spot, I'll support that. But I never want to make a compromise between a good spot and a worse spot because somebody tells us I'm going to go to a worse spot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so when I went there, I said, you know, I really think that Medicaid expansion was something that voters didn't have accurate information on. I think it wasn't a good process. And so I think as a legislature, before we fund this thing, we really ought to step back and take a look at it. And so the very first thing I did was co-sponsor a Medicaid repeal bill. Just to put it out there
And what happened?
and let the legislature look at it. And it died in committee. It was a 5-7 vote, which actually is pretty representative of how the vote came out on the ballot. And that's okay. But for me, I'd opposed Medicaid expansion all the way through my campaign. I wrote a big editorial and put it in the paper right before the general election. People knew how I felt about that and what my position was. And so I felt like I wanted to be true to my position on that issue. And once I'd done what I could do, then I was ready to take the next step. So that's how that went down. Yeah.
I have a question. So do you think they'll try to do the legislation again? Even
The
though-
initiative,
Do you think they'll try again?
I don't know. It was pretty painful.
Yeah.
But I think if we see a lot of really liberal initiatives on the ballot that kind of get some public support and concern built up around the issue, I think that's what would make the difference. Oh.
But what about educating people about the difference between the democracy and representative government? How can we help people understand that? Don't you think more people would be open to it? Or
Yeah.
willing, I mean, if they
Homeschool your
heard
children.
it, no, if they heard it more often, like, I don't know, Facebook, editorials, whatever.
We
Talk
each need to
about
do everything
principles.
that we can, and that's actually one of the reasons that I like to include that, and I'm planning to include that as I go around and do cottage meetings and town halls in the interim, so that people have an opportunity to think about that principle.
Maybe another editorial in the news about what actually happened and what you kind of laid out for us here tonight would get all those people to see it too.
Okay, yeah, good suggestion, good suggestion. Let's take just a minute and talk money, unless people have some burning questions. This was something that I really had to wrap my brain around, because my budget has never been in the millions. Certainly not in the billions. So that really took some work for me to kind of wrap my brain around what was going on here. So this right here is a 22-year history of general fund spending. These are your state tax dollars. This is not federal tax dollars. This is not dedicated funds like the gas tax and things like that goes for roads. This is your state tax dollars here. So you can see in 1998, these are in millions. We spent $15.5 million on public schools. In 2019, oh, that's the change one. You know what? I am so sorry. I was looking at that thinking that did not look right. Okay, I'm going to pull it out of my folder here. I'll tell you the right numbers. I pulled the wrong.
So what's the change
Graph.
one?
So that's showing how much the budget changed from the previous year. So it's still interesting to look at, but it's not.
In 1998 to 99, like how much it?
There we go. I was thinking that did not sound right.
It's like
Okay, I'll change that before I go to my next. See they're side by side here? And they look almost identical. Okay, so in 1998, if this was the chart that was showing the actual appropriations, we spent $705 million on public schools. That's more like it. In 2019, we spent $1,785,000,000. That's how much our spending has increased over the last 22 years.
So do you have any percentage?
So let's see, 700 to about 1,800. So 2.5,
It's like 130%
Times?
up.
yeah,
Yeah, it's like double.
it's increased 150%. Here's another one, health and welfare. Yeah,
We ought to find out what the population of the school district in Shelley was 20 years ago. It was less. I mean, it was more then than it is now. And what was the money that was spent 20 years ago?
about 20 years ago, 705 million
And how
was
much
the
now?
state budget. 1,785 million
And we have less students now than we had 20
in
years ago.
Shelley.
How much has the dollar decreased in value since,
Well, that's a good question too. Let me give you another one to show, this is kind of across the board. Health and welfare in 1998 was 236 million. And this is our state dollars. The other Medicaid budget I told you included federal dollars, so there's a difference there. In 2019, it was 765 million. But that's just the state dollars. Because the health and welfare budget has actually grown a lot more than that because a lot of it is federal. So that's across the board. If you look at this chart, it's 2 and 3 times our spendings. So I thought a good number to look at, just to put things in perspective, here's our GDP, our gross domestic product. So same time period, it was 40 billion in 1997. This chart starts in 1998. In 2016, it was 60 billion. So our GDP's gone up 50%, but our spending has gone up 150% during that time. So I don't know how that makes you feel, but that concerns me. So here's some other couple little financial things just to put our state budget into perspective. This right here is our general fund. That's our state dollars that we just had on that chart up there. So this is where it's coming from. You can see almost half of it is your income tax. Then we've got sales tax and corporate taxes and some other things. Then down here, this is how it's spent. About 50%. Oh crap. What did I do? I'll let you do whatever you need to there. About 50% of the budget goes to public schools. So then, I have that in here too. This is all, actually you can find this on the state website if anybody is a numbers person and is curious.
How much per student is that? Do you have any idea?
I could find that for you, but I don't know it off the top of my
I
head.
was curious.
So this all comes from the legislative budget book, and if anybody's ever curious, you can go to legislature.idaho.gov, and then there's a block you can click on, the Legislative Services Office. Maybe some of you are trying to find it on your phones. You can if you want. Legislative Services Office. I don't remember what BPA stands for. It's budget something. Analyst or something, and then PUBS, publications, I think is what that is. So you just click on those things and it will show you everything about the budget. Will it get brighter in a second?
I was hoping it would, but
No,
I'm not touching that.
Okay,
It is coming.
I think you can see it well enough. Over here on the other side, now we've added in the federal funds and the dedicated funds, which are like the gas tax, things that have a fee that's for a specific purpose and it goes to a specific agency. So you can see our federal funds are 34.7% of our state budget now. A third of our state budget is federal money. So I know a lot of us here are probably getting frustrated sometimes when we look at the federal deficit.
The thing that seems really frustrating to me about that is every time we take money from the federal government, they have something to twist around with.
They do.
And I don't think people realize how much they use that against the states.
Absolutely. They really do. We really do see that. So we compromise our sovereignty and our independence, our ability to act in the best interest of Idaho when we become dependent on those dollars. And we are becoming increasingly dependent on federal dollars.
And they're far away. So they don't know who we are.
Yeah.
They're on the other side of the country.
Yeah, a lot of them don't know where Idaho is, and we like it that way.
Is that the same for every state, about the same percent, you think?
I don't know. I don't know, but in Idaho, that's what it is.
We were just, my husband and I were just discussing how much we're paying California for all their garbage from the federal. And I didn't realize it's this high in Idaho.
Right, well,
It's
and another
crazy.
thing to know too is we were told when Medicaid expansion was being discussed that we needed to get some of those federal dollars that belong to Idaho and bring them back to Idaho so they weren't going to other states. Well, guess how much Idaho already gets back from the federal government for every dollar that we send?
Something like 18 or something like
$1.30.
Oh, is that right?
So we already get back $1.30 for every dollar that we actually pay in federal taxes. There are no Idaho dollars going to other states.
Oh, good. I did that.
Yeah, what we have is we're just
getting more
adding
back.
to the debt. That's all we're doing right now. We're putting it on our children.
So if we took away that third, what would we cut?
Well, a lot of it is health and welfare. And that's not the only thing, but a lot of it is. And this is another important thing to notice. You see education funding down there used to be about half of our budget if you looked back 20 years. Now it's closer to a third. And I believe this year, for the first time, our health and human services spending has outpaced our education spending. So our education budget this year, this is in millions, is $3,007,000,000, and our health and human services is $3,074,000,000. So we actually, Medicaid expansion and the other welfare programs that we have been growing in the state of Idaho have now outpaced education in terms of our state budget. When I look at those things, transportation is a constitutional responsibility of the state. Providing a public education system is a constitutional responsibility of the state. Even caring for the blind and those who are mentally disabled is part of our constitutional responsibility. It's in our state constitution. But providing free health care for people and a lot of these other things that we're doing are not constitutional responsibilities. And the more we do those things, the more they're going to threaten the things that really are constitutional responsibilities. So, reason for caution. That's what that is. So let's talk about regulation. Are we ready to move to regulation? Red tape. Everybody loves bureaucratic rules, right? And we really like the fact that executive agencies can write rules that then get treated just like laws in a court, and we all get held accountable for following them. Right?
Yeah.
It's one of our favorite things. In the state of Idaho, we did something a few years back, which was really a great thing, but we didn't go quite far enough. And that is that we gave the legislature the authority to review the rules that get written by the executive agencies. And that's a good thing. The reason I say we didn't go quite far enough is that the way things are right now, those rules have to be disapproved by both the House and the Senate, or they become law. So that means that if an executive agency can get it approved in either the House or the Senate, it becomes law. So every other kind of law that we write has to pass both the House and the Senate, because that's the legislature and they have the lawmaking authority. But you can also make a law with the Department of Health and Welfare and the Senate. Or you can make a law with an executive agency and one chairman in either the House or the Senate who decides that his committee's not going to review that rule. And so he just sticks it in his drawer, and consequently, it doesn't get disapproved. And it now becomes law. And we had that situation this last year with a number of things. One classic, really frustrating example was a new executive rule that made it so that people could change their gender on their birth certificate and leave no record. And the chairman of the committee that was supposed to review that rule in the Senate decided that he didn't want to review it. So he stuck it in the drawer, and so it becomes law with no opportunity for the legislature to do anything about it. And that has happened too many times. And so Governor Little kind of said he's going to attack this bureaucratic red tape thing, and he passed, what was it, the red tape, he passed an executive order about red tape saying that all the executive agencies now have to repeal 2 rules for every new rule they make. So that's great. That's great. And in his little press release, he said we have 736 chapters of executive rules, regulations, 8,278 pages, and at least 72,000 total restrictions. That's a lot. So the House of Representatives was really frustrated with a lot of the things that happened with this in the past. And we put forward a bill, House Bill 100 this year, that would require bicameral, 2 houses, approval for the rules. So they had to be approved in both the House and the Senate. And ironically, the Senate decided that they were not going to do anything with that, and so it got stuck in a drawer. and they said that first of all, they said there's too many freshman legislators in the House, and they really don't know what they're doing. So we don't think that they should have the authority to stop the executive agencies. And
why don't we go for an initiative to change that? And make it mandatory.
you know what? We might have to. We might have to. So
You're gonna be the chair of it, right? You're gonna chair that.
there we go.
I'll give you an illustration. 6 months ago, I took an application down to Bingham County for a building permit to add 2 bedrooms on to a manufactured home that I own out in the country. That was 6 months ago. No decision. So I can't build. That's an agency
It's in somebody's
that
drawer.
refuses to tell me yay or nay. Now, I have the right as an ex-attorney, and not practicing anymore, but I could file a petition to mandate to force them to make a decision. But not every person who makes an application with them have that ability. So why should I be, or you be, in that situation?
Well, and if you push it, it'll probably be no.
It's crazy.
It is crazy. It is. And it's frustrating. It is. So we decided we were going to try and do something. We put House Bill 100 forward. It got stuck in a drawer in the Senate. They wouldn't even hear it. And so as the session came to a close, people were frustrated with the governor's office. They were frustrated with a lot of the stuff that's gone on in the Senate. People were tired. And there's a going home bill that you always pass. And this is another good thing that we have in our system of government. Those agency rules actually expire, all of them, every year on June 30th. And in order to continue, the legislature has to pass a bill that renews them for the next year. That's the going home bill. So the members of the House got together and we said, we have rules this year that we were adamantly opposed to that didn't even get heard in the Senate. And if we just pass this going home bill, those things will all be approved. And it'll be done. And besides that, they haven't even been willing to work with us on trying to improve the situation. So, the last 2 days of the session, with strong support all the way across the Republican caucus, from the most liberal to the most conservative members, we took that going home bill and we stuck House Bill 100 inside of it. And we sent it to the Senate. So at that point, the Senate had two choices. They could vote yes, and they could adopt House Bill 100 and renew the rules for the next year. Or they could vote no
Kill everything.
and kill all the executive rules, which means that they become temporary rules. And the agencies
So
have
temporary.
to go through a process then of posting them as temporary rules. And then all of those rules, not just the new ones, all of those rules have to be reviewed and approved the next year. Because they're all temporary. So we sent it to the Senate, and the Senate killed it. And then the Senate put together a new version of the going home bill. They tweaked a couple words because you can't send the exact same bill again. And they sent it back to the House. And the leadership of the House referred it to a committee. And the chairman of that committee stuck that bill in the drawer. And we adjourned.
So it's all temporary rules?
So June 30th, all of the executive agency rules will expire.
Good job.
That's just awesome.
Oh, that's awesome.
I'll be able to do some work now.
Yeah, yeah. So the problem is not entirely fixed
Right.
because we still need to get a system in place whereby those rules will have to be reviewed and approved in both sides of the legislature.
And
That's
how
the
much
end
it
goal.
is? Like, all of that is all of the rules?
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of
8,000
work.
pages.
It's gonna be a lot of work for the House, but it's gonna be a lot of work for the Senate too. And it's
Wow,
gonna
that
be a
was a
lot of
good
work
one.
for the executive agencies.
Will the news spin this against
So,
us?
They might. They might. I mean, there's always somebody that will be unhappy. But one of the things that opens it up for is that things that have just been accepted as water under the bridge, we have an opportunity to raise objections to them too.
So how do we follow it? And what do we do about this?
I think there will be some organized efforts to help get those rules reviewed. And so if you are somebody who is willing to help with that process, I know that there will be people collecting input and I'm going to facilitate that. I know that
I
you
can't
can
even
get on the
fathom
website.
what that's like.
But
I mean,
really, what I would say, first of all, just right out of the chute, if there are things that you've run into in terms of regulations or rules that deal with state agencies that have been frustrating, this is a good time to make people aware that there's a problem.
But if you haven't encountered anything like that, where can you learn more?
All of the state agencies have everything online, and I can try to do a good job. I will try to,
Keep us informed.
yeah, keep you in the loop.
Okay. Like how?
If you have, this is what I'll do. If you have already signed up for my email list, then you'll get whatever I send out. If you haven't yet, all you have to do is go to the it's house.idaho.gov website. It's the official legislative webpage, and click on the House, and there's a list of members. And right by my name, there's a little box where you can click it and get on the email list. So if you want to do that, then as we get things more organized, I will be sending some information out. on that.
Will this stay as
So-
House Bill 100 or will it change?
Well, they killed it, and so
So-
it's dead for the session. And so when the idea comes back, it will have a different number.
Okay, so you'll keep us informed on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there are a lot of issues that we deal with, but I think in government, when you've got an issue that affects the actual form of government itself, that's the most important kind of issue, because it's gonna affect everything that follows.
So I'm gonna ask a question. In federal government, they pass bills. Those bills go to the executive or to the bureaucrats, and they make the rules. And so they interpret the law and make the rules. Does that work that way in Idaho too?
Yes, it's similar. Very, same idea. Yeah.
Okay.
Julianne, not to change the subject, but we here in Shelley have been waiting for this highway out here to be a 5-lane highway for probably 50 years.
Mhm.
And they just keep putting it off. They put the bridge in and now they're putting it off again. What can we do about that?
You know what, I talked to the Department of Transportation about that, and he sent me an email, but it was clear back at the beginning of the session, and I don't remember what he said. But I can look for the email.
Yeah, the traffic is just getting so bad and you have somebody going 35 miles an hour clear to the junction and then they speed up. It's like, why are you going, you know?
And I
it's
do
really
remember the gist of it was that it was down the list.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be on the top, you know, oh, you're next, and we've heard that for 50 years, so, I don't know, I think they just keep giving the money to Ada County.
Right, and Ada County is growing
Yes,
fast,
they
and
are.
we saw a lot of things
Yeah,
like that.
good.
Yeah,
Oh,
all
They
right.
have a big voting block, we
That's
don't want
true.
them to be there.
Okay, so when you came in, you asked me what was the thing that was the most concerning to me during the session. And one of the things that my experience really solidified in me is the need for all of us to be active and involved if we want to preserve our freedom. These pictures here on the left are pictures of flyers that were posted at the Boise Library. These are organizations that are recruiting Boise State students to participate in their activities. So right here, the Alt Campus Read is meeting on Sundays, 5 p.m. on or near campus. And they've got all kinds of topics of discussion here. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see any of those? A few of them are Accelerate the Manifesto, Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel, Capitalist Realism, Assorted Readings by Our Parents Karl Marx and Judith Butler. Just Your Friendly Local Postmodern Feminist Neo-Marxist Club to undermine the foundations of Western culture by talking about philosophy and critical theory.
Fun group.
Yeah,
Well, they can have that immediately, they can move to Venezuela.
there you go. The other one over here was another group, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Join the fight against capitalism, racism, and imperialism. Make a job, free healthcare, education, and affordable housing constitutional rights. Fight racism. Stop police brutality and mass incarceration. Equality for women and free, safe, legal abortions on demand. Full rights for all immigrants. Full equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. Defend workers and labor unions. Seize the banks. Jail Wall Street criminals.
Which universities?
So this is Boise. This is Boise State. This is downtown Boise. When I read these, this is treason.
To make you worried
These
about
are
the
people
future.
who are deliberately working to overthrow our system of government. And they're not afraid to post it in the open and openly recruit students. And as I was there at the Capitol, I watched groups of these people. It was always the same people over and over again. It didn't matter if the issue was landlord-tenant contract. It didn't matter if it was Medicaid, didn't matter if it was the initiative, whatever it was. If it affected free healthcare, affordable housing, any of those things, they were there advocating for the changes that they want to see in government.
Who pays those? Welfare recipients. They
I
don't
think
have
that-
a job.
Yeah, I think a lot of them probably don't have jobs. I don't know that they're necessarily paid to be there, but they can afford to be.
We pay them with our taxes.
Yeah.
We pay them
And,
with our taxes.
and the other one up
I
here,
know, but we know that some people get paid to be protesters. And
Yes.
they're professional at it, and they know what to do and how to do it. They don't represent us, they represent the guy that's paying them.
right.
And evidently, we have the same thing in our capital here.
George
I-
Soros, Michael Bloomberg,
Community
pump a lot of
organizers.
money into
Yeah,
these things.
community organizers.
And I can't tell you that I've seen evidence that individual people are paid, but what I can tell you is, right in the middle there is a post that came off of the Reclaim Idaho Facebook page, or maybe it's their web page. I think it's their web page. Reclaim Idaho wants to remove state lawmakers over Medicaid initiatives bills. And then the article goes on to describe how they're planning to unseat the legislators that worked for sideboards and for limits on the initiative process and all those kinds of things. These are the people that were at the Capitol opposing those things, and we know that those organizations got significant out-of-state funding for the Medicaid expansion. So I don't have evidence that individual people were paid, but I know for certain that some of these organizations are giving out state funders.
Cass, this is gonna be an opinion, I don't know if you know the answer. So why would out-of-staters care whether we expand our Medicaid? Unless it's the
shouldn't.
hospitals or whatever.
They shouldn't. They just shouldn't.
Well, except
But
for if you get enough states on board with them, they can make it a federal law.
Yeah,
And that's why they're in here trying to influence little old Idaho
right.
to be one of the 27 states they need to make it federal.
Right, and Idaho's relatively cheap,
Yeah.
you know, compared to other states. We're pretty easy to buy and to get policies through.
Barack Obama had set up an organization, Organize for America. And he went and hired all the people that worked on his campaign throughout all of America. And anytime he needs somebody to go protest anywhere, all he does is make a phone call. Or his aides make a phone call, and they're there. They're there to protest.
And we know those kinds of things happen. And so because we know that they have a plan, I mean, they're deciding who they're going to get in the next election. They're deciding what policies they're going to support and oppose, and they're making plans to rally and to picket and to show up at the hearings, and they're active. And we have to be too, in our own way. It doesn't mean that we have to do it the same way they do it. We can be more effective than they are, but we have to do something. So this is something kind of inspirational and neat though. On the right-hand side is part of a poem that might sound familiar to you. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Did you know today is the anniversary of Paul Revere's ride? That's kind of neat, huh? A hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pedals in passing a spark struck out by a steed that flies fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. That's not the whole thing. You can go home and read the whole thing if you want to, but kind of fun to know that it's the anniversary of some of those events.
Well, even in his effort, he still only had less than 10%, closer to 5% of the population then that rose up to revolt against England. The rest of them sat around on their hands and did nothing.
That's right. And just a few people can make a big difference if we're willing to.
Well, you know you're doing the right thing if Reclaim Idaho wants to defeat you.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. So, thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight. I'll be happy to stay around and visit a minute more, but I think we'll honor our time commitment here and go ahead and end at 8:30. And I just appreciate you a lot. We'll be doing some more cottage meetings and town hall type things and working to get organized. So, sign up for the email list and I'll keep you in the loop.
Thank you.
Thank you.